Hi class. Um, so today we are starting chapter 6 on deviance. I can't say this is the most deviant thing I've done in my life, but to give you an example, particularly if this were an in-class, normal class on campus, it would generally be professionally frowned upon, and I might get yelled at by my department chair for teaching to you in a soccer jersey. So that's my act of deviance for the day. This is Toronto FC, Toronto Football Club, which is, as you know, close to Buffalo. So we generally frown upon college instructors and professors teaching in sports memorabilia. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about today, previous chapters we talked about norms and things like social order, social harmony, and the flip side of that, or the opposite, is deviance. For something to be a norm or normal, there has to be an abnormal or deviant corollary to that. So no tie, no dress shirt. Definitely should not be wearing a soccer jersey in class. If you ever see me on campus doing that, call campus police because I've obviously had a mental breakdown. So to start out thinking about this chapter, a few different ways we can think about deviance. Behavior, how we are socialized, cultural beliefs, particularly religious beliefs, but anything that kind of falls within the rubric of society, culture. So we have a long list of examples here. Medical conditions, if you're born with a facial disfigurement, having AIDS or HIV, even cancer. So things that fall outside the spectrum of what we consider to be normal. And of course, normal is an arbitrary concept, something that changes over time. But we can also think about something that falls outside the normal of common. So normal is something we think about a society or culture agreeing upon as being something valuable for that society and culture that should occur repeatedly. Say like marriage. We generally think about marriage as being healthy for a society to maintain itself, reproduce itself, and to provide a sense of order, stability, continuity. Whereas common is something outside of our control that we can't necessarily agree upon. Say, the fact that most men grow some kind of facial hair, whether they want to or not, and have to either let it go and look like a crazy lumberjack. They can shave every day down to their bare skin, which is way more trouble than it's worth, in my opinion, as you've noticed. You can try to at least keep it looking kind of professional and trim, as I do, so I don't look, totally crazy, or at least professionally presentable. So something like that, is common, not really something we can do much about. Facial hair on women, fairly rare, doesn't look like male facial hair, rarely, if ever. But there are certainly cultural beliefs that that's something much to the detriment of women because it's stressful and time-consuming, is that we somehow convinced ourselves that that is abnormal to the point of stigmatizing on a woman. Some pot or pan just fell in my kitchen, in case you heard that. I'm sure everything's fine. Nothing exploded. Nothing's on fire. but that definitely startled me. So that's kind of easing us into thinking about deviance. This is a long chapter, a lot of different sections, some of which I'm going to talk about, some of which I'm not. Others I'll briefly touch upon and will give you some opportunities to teach yourself some of the material and dig deeper. Again, like previous chapters, I uploaded some additional short YouTube videos from elsewhere, as well as an article or two to let you think about different types of deviance. All right. So as I talked about in terms of starting out, things that are common, this would be called the statistical approach. So, for example, men who are born under, 5'7" are considered abnormally short based on what is statistically common. Women over, 5'11", certainly over 6 feet, are considered abnormal just because it's statistically uncommon. Men, on average, tend to be taller than women, but it doesn't mean that obviously you can have women who are taller than men. Those of you who follow American pop culture, Jason Statham, popular actor, notably from the Fast and Furious series, I think he's like 5'7", 5'8", and he's married to Rose Huntington Whiteley, an actress and model, and she's like 6'3", I think. And when you see pictures of them together, say like on a red carpet for a awards show, she really kind of towers over him. He's a confident guy, so he doesn't care. He's Jason Statham. He's really strong, and so he doesn't care what you think. But you don't often see a woman that much taller than a man. It's just statistically uncommon. And it kind of stands out when we see it, even though there's certainly nothing wrong with it. So statistically uncommon stuff, not really that interesting. I mean, it's kind of interesting, but I think what gets more interesting is when we start thinking about the difference between norms and deviance, the difference between things we consider moral or ethical and their opposite, say like murder, abortion, drug use, sexual behavior. The arbitrary nature by which we make things legal or illegal. And so all of these, though, fall within social norms, whether it be morality and ethics. So ethics, for those of you who have had philosophy classes, ethics we generally think of as individual ideas about right and wrong. So like, what are my ethics? When we think about morality, we generally think about that as culturally or socially prescribed. So what is a society's morality? What is American morality? How does morality differ in the American South compared to the American North, or between America and Europe? So morality we consider social or cultural. What is a norm? Ethics we generally consider to be more individual. So like drug use, certain kinds of drug use violates individuals' morality, violates individuals' ethics, but not others. I'm sure we all know lots of people who don't care that weed is illegal. Although for some of you, hopefully not for long. I bet it would make introduction to sociology a lot easier. And so thinking back to our chapter on socialization, the way culture teaches us right and wrong gives us ideas about how we are supposed to act. So in the chapter on socialization, we talked about learning to brush your teeth. Having good teeth, white teeth, not missing any teeth, is also something Certainly in American culture, we take as a sign of kind of individual social standing. Are you being a good citizen? So ideas about hygiene are tied in with ideas about ethics and morality. So then we have the legal approach. So always thinking about deviance, we can distinguish between what on page 101 is called the difference between crime, sin, and poor taste. So a sin, generally think of as a religious term, something that violates something from a religious text. Generally we think of that being the Christian Bible, but it could be the Torah or the Quran or some other religious text. But in America, we think of sin as a religious term, invoking Christian morality. But think about infidelity as a sin, cheating on your partner, particularly if you're married. So that's not necessarily illegal. Generally now in 2019, not illegal in America to cheat on your partner. But we generally have some major ideas of what that means about that person's ethics. We would generally say they've acted immorally, because even if they haven't violated a law, they've violated our society's ideas about what it means to be a good person and a good citizen. Acting in poor taste. If I taught a class at University of Buffalo really blinged out, wearing like a huge thick gold chain, wearing like a diamond encrusted Rolex watch, let's say I come from a really wealthy background, think of like what you see in like a rap video, and that's what I show up wearing to teach. Still wearing all the normal teaching garb I should be wearing, tie, blazer, dress shirt, looking like a good proper professor in training, but maybe wearing some huge thick gold chain or having like gold plated teeth. So just think of this like totally lavish, exorbitant presentation. That's just what we would call a deviance of poor taste. Not something that can get me fired compared to wearing maybe a soccer jersey repeatedly to teach in. But generally we would think of that as being gaudy. And so it's deviant in the sense that I'm violating a norm. But it might be one that's where people end up looking at me weird. You think, oh, Professor Matt's just kind of quirky. Someone should have a talk with him so we can make sure he gets his shit together. And then, of course, there are crimes which are illegal. Don't get caught with cocaine in your car at the toll booth. That would be bad. That happens, you will probably not be finishing Introduction to Sociology anytime soon. I don't know what kind of Wi-Fi you get in your jail cell. So those are kind of our main ways of thinking about deviance. Really, kind of the legal and the moral, and the behavioral. Or we could think of it being as the individual. And so this ties in with what we would call the normative approach. And so, unlike the legalistic approach, which is you're just violating a law, people probably a lot of us violate a crime or commit a crime probably at least once a week. Probably on the highway. You roll through a stop sign, speed on the highway, don't use your turn signal. Any of you who enjoy a joint with your friends, your secret's safe with me. Any of you who are under 21 and go to frat parties on campus at UB and drink and make bad decisions, even though those are all things we consider culturally normal and to a certain extent culturally accepted or socially accepted, they're all still violations of the law. So sanctions, what happens when we act deviant? You might get yelled at by your boss if you're continually late. So sanctions are punishments, or at least reactions, but usually some type of punishment, or can also be made as rehabilitation. Say like a sanction for drug use could be having to go to rehab if you have a very nice accommodating judge at your trial. Formal sanctions are ones that are formally codified in law or by some other formal legitimized agency. So let's say it's deviant in our culture for men to have erectile dysfunction, particularly at certain ages. If your doctor prescribes you a prescription, say like Viagra, to fix that, it's probably not something you're telling your friends because you're embarrassed. There's stigma, you feel like a deviant, you feel like things are supposed to be working in that general realm. I'm not going to explain this to you because that would be creepy. But if you get a prescription, that would be a formal sanction, or at least a formal response. Any type of sentencing you get for violating a law will be a formal sanction. Now, an informal sanction, so that's something more cultural or social in nature. So in this case, let's say you have a very traditional family who doesn't accept that you are gay or lesbian. And let's say they excommunicate you or don't talk to you for a long time. That would be an informal sanction. A friend finds out you cheated on your girlfriend or boyfriend. They don't talk to you. They're really angry. That'd be an informal sanction. So a formal sanction you can think as something being probably that exists on paper somewhere. There's a paper trail by a formal authority. Generally, we think of this as being legal or medical. If you get caught cheating at UB, and you have an email from the dean saying you're on academic probation, that's a formal sanction. If your instructor catches you cheating and gives you a second chance, maybe gives you the benefit of the doubt, feels like it was an honest mistake rather than a intentional action, then that the informal sanction maybe you have to do the assignment over, but there's no paper trail that you're doing the assignment over. So in which case that's hell. And maybe there's nothing in the syllabus about how to handle that. So in which case that would be an informal sanction. And of course, as usual, I'm taking way too long with this chapter, but there's so much fun stuff to talk about in deviance. It's one of my more favored things to teach because there's so much to talk about. Relativist and absolutist perspective. So the relativist perspective would be that ideas about right and wrong, think about, say, ideas about abortion, sexuality, drug use, vary across time and place. It's easier to think about. We generally think about over time society is becoming more open, but comparing certain countries to others is an easy way to think about the relativistic response. Homosexuality is still outlawed in some countries compared to others. You can drink at a younger age in Canada and I believe Europe compared to the United States. Think about variations in gun laws. So there are different cultural ideas about right and wrong. You might think your society or culture is right about a certain thing, but then you go somewhere else and it's different. How do you make sense of that? Something isn't necessarily right just because you happen to be born in a particular place and time with its own particular sets of ideas about right and wrong. You have to recognize that other societies and cultures have different ideas about things, And people are born into those places and times, whether just like you, whether they want to or not. No one chooses where they're born. If they could, I bet a lot of people would choose other places. Then, of course, the absolutist perspective would be doing just what I talked about, which is assuming there are these concrete, non-negotiable ideas about right and wrong. So, for example, maybe murder. Well, we have laws about the right to self-defense for murder. Abortion. Well, we at least have laws and ideas that abortion is justifiable when a woman's life is at stake. Speeding, maybe you're going 90 miles per hour in a 60 mile per hour zone. You'll probably get off the hook if maybe a person in your back seat is bleeding to death and you're rushing them to the hospital. Probably someone in one of my soccer games that I tackled, more than likely. But so in that case, it's easy to think about certain exceptions to things that we might think of as being absolute, even if those exceptions are incredibly rare. Not a whole lot of cases where a normal, non-law enforcement citizen has to go 90 and a 60 on the highway. It's not very often someone has to commit murder in a self-defense situation. Although just because they're rare doesn't mean those things aren't important. Conflict perspective, so thinking back to earlier chapters. So remember, we've used the conflict perspective to think about generally how the powerful control the powerless, or at least those with less power. And so one way to think about this would be from the conflict perspective. What would be a good example? A good example would be corporations fighting hard to prevent workers from unionizing. So I feel like in American culture, some of you in this class may disagree with me, and that's okay. But I think in American culture, unions are generally stigmatized and seen as a bad thing. That mindset has some justification, but only I think it's between 9 and 12% of the American workforce is unionized. In the 80s, it was a much, much larger number. So over the last 3 to 4 centuries, we've had mass-scale deunionization. Whether that's right or wrong, I'll let you decide, particularly when we get in our chapter on economic inequality. But that's a fact that we have less union participation than we did in the 80s and 90s. So recently, those of you who are Buffalonians know that Spot Coffee in Buffalo, their workers have been trying to unionize. And so workplaces doing everything they can to prevent workers from unionizing is a example of the conflict perspective, in that in most American workplaces, the idea of unions is seen as deviant and abnormal. So in this case, unions are really kind of the opposite of the norm, generally speaking. There are some industries that are still very unionized. K through 12 education is a profession that's still largely unionized. Whether that's good or bad, I'll let you decide. But it's just a fact that education K through 12 still has a fairly strong union presence. So that's an example of the conflict perspective. An example of trying to prevent workers from gaining more rights, but the methods by which they try to earn more rights, say like more equitable pay, as seen as stigmatizing. Some other examples might be the way mental illness is used to stigmatize people. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. Stigma is a big part of this chapter. The way we might try to police women's sexual behavior by calling them sluts or whores. Particularly in American culture, we still live in a society that really prioritizes marriage and sexual behavior within marriage, and if not within marriage, then certainly within the context of serial monogamy. We generally still think of casual sex, casual dating as abnormal and deviant, and potentially as saying something about that person's morality or ethics. And so the word slut is often used to shame women, and sometimes men, but historically more towards women. And so hurtful words like calling someone a nut, but maybe they're on an antidepressant, calling someone a slut just because they, we will say, like to have a good time, broadly construed. Those are hurtful labels meant to kind of push and coerce people into more socially normal and socially approved roles. What else do we got? So, long dramatic pause. So, in our moving over, the chapter should have started with our kind of initial thinkings about crime and deviance. It didn't. I did not write this textbook. But one thing I want you to think about, going back to chapter 2 on sociological theory, particularly thinking about structural functionalism, is one of our founding fathers of sociology, Emil Durkheim, thought long and hard about what keeps communities together and what variations across certain types of communities cause different outcomes. And so Durkheim actually studied suicide, another behavior we think of as being deviant in all kinds of ways, religiously, morally, ethically, individually. I think even legally, I think certain countries actually have laws about suicide. So if you change your mind or if you fail, I think there can be legal complications for you potentially. But Durkheim studied in the 18th century variations in suicide rates, differences in suicide rates among Protestants and Catholics. And he found suicide rates were lower in Catholic communities because Catholics have a stronger sense of community, because church attendance is required in Catholicism compared to Protestantism. And so being a Catholic requires church attendance in a different way compared to Protestantism. And so those stronger social bonds, so when we think of social order, social harmony, those strong social bonds to Durkheim give people a sense of meaning, a sense of community, and make it less likely they do something like commit suicide. And so the social cause or social state, individual state that leads to suicide, Durkheim calls anomie. So this is on page 104, A-N-O-M-I-E. It's a French term. That's why it sounds fancy. Anomie. You can tell I know nothing about French whatsoever. But So anomie is a state of normlessness, what Durkheim calls a lack of emotional regulation. You can kind of think of it as meaning existential dread or existential crisis. You can think of it as meaning not knowing who you are, not having a place in society. Anomie is particularly common during periods of vast social change, when in some cases someone's social place gets kind of left behind due to major social change. So in many cases you can have anomie, which is this feeling of being lost, and to such an extent that it maybe leads to taking your own life, as something that leads to all kinds of deviant behavior, maybe sexual promiscuity, particularly unsafe, reckless sexual promiscuity, hard, dangerous drug use, say like using maybe someone else's syringe. So really bad, reckless behavior. Durkheim also has some important thoughts about crime. So here on page 104 and 105, that we think of crime as this thing to eliminate, but crime is actually kind of inherent in how communities define themselves, whether it be in law or whether it be something more deviant that violates a norm. Because we have to have ideas about right and wrong, and people have to commit wrongs to have an idea about what is right. So crime is actually inherent necessity for social cohesion, social organization. And so we think of it as something to eliminate, but it's really something to minimize. But it is always present as an idea, kind of at the fabric of how a society or community, or you could even as a workplace, how they define themselves. And so in this case, crime is a social necessity, not just some type of social evil. There's another, I promise, I'm not going to hold you hostage. Speaking of deviance, if I literally hold you hostage, I'd have much larger problems than wearing a soccer jersey to class. Merton's anomie theory. So Robert Merton, kind of mid-century, early 20th century, mid-century American sociologist, one of the most famous kind of classical American sociologists. So on page 106, has us thinking about how people respond to anomie. And so American culture specifically, he's studying American culture, has this strong emphasis on professional and social success, particularly in monetary terms. Think of it really as monetary success. But we can also think about it as social status, being at the top of a competition hierarchy or a dominance hierarchy. And so basically being powerful, or at least not powerless, right? So you think of having a comfortable middle class status compared to most other chunks of the population makes you look powerful. And so Merton says that, of course, there are legitimate ways to achieve this success. But let's say you don't. And so in that case, people take illegitimate means, maybe like selling drugs. In the academic context, this could be cheating. You cheat maybe to get A's because you want to be top of your class and get into a really good graduate school, get a really good job. You want to be seen as being incredibly intelligent to employers with your 4.0 GPA. So in which case, if you take illegitimate means to achieve success, then that would be an example of what Merton calls anomie theory. So maybe you have a low-paying job, you want to buy a fancy house, you sell lots of drugs, pay for your house in cash. So then you've used an illegitimate means, selling drugs, to achieve a socially legitimate end, which is home ownership. And in American culture, as American students will know, Home ownership is one of the most major forms of kind of proper social standing you can have. And so home ownership is something people aspire to. It is part of this kind of emphasis on financial success that Merton's talking about. And just for the record, I never plan on owning a house because that is a huge amount of responsibility, and teaching Introduction to Sociology is about all the responsibility I can handle. I'm totally fine renting for the rest of my life. My sister owns a house, and it might as well be like having another child. That is my rant for the day. Life lessons. Life lessons from Instructor Mateo. I try to give you at least one a lecture. Don't tell your parents. What else we got? I'm already at minute 36. I only wanted this to be about 30 minutes. I'm running over. What are the other important parts of this chapter? So the last part, I'll talk about them all in tandem. If you look at page 112, 111. So 112 on stigma. And then page 110 to 111, primary deviance and secondary deviance, labeling, and the medicalization of deviance. All those we can kind of think about together in tandem. So to start, primary deviance easily is kind of the first thing you do that's deviant. And so let's say you sell drugs, get caught, go to jail. You sold a large enough batch of drugs. Do they even quantify drugs in batches? I have no idea. But you sell a large enough quantity that it's a felony charge rather than a misdemeanor. And so you come out of jail. So if you're a felon, those of you who don't know, in America, it's really hard to find work. You can't vote. Being a felon strips you of most rights, and so there's a large problem about when felons are released from prison and reintegrated into society. There aren't a lot of places for them to reintegrate to. And so in many cases, felons, these are kind of like what we call ex-cons, end up doing things in the informal or illegal economy, say like selling drugs. And so let's say if selling drugs was the primary deviance that resulted in incarceration, secondary deviance would be new deviance resulting from the first deviance. So the secondary deviance in this case might be working construction illegally under the table for cash in hand, which is illegal, even though plenty of people do it. It's still illegal. But that would be the secondary deviance because this person cannot be employed necessarily or may have trouble gaining employment as a legitimate employee. And so working illegally in some way would be the secondary deviance. Or a more extreme example, let's say stealing cars. Maybe this person feels that's a much safer way of making money than selling drugs. So they switch to something else like stealing cars. Someone can be happy to steal my Nissan Rogue because I think it's falling apart. So in that case, being an ex-con, being a felon, or even having been in prison for a long time under only, say, major misdemeanor charges is incredibly stigmatizing. So stigma is really kind of a mark of social shame. So when someone acts deviant, they violate a social idea of what is right. And so they violate social and cultural moral scripts of some kind. That shaming is stigmatizing. So think of stigma as basically feeling like something is wrong with you because of something you've done, but that society sees there as being something wrong with you because of something you've done. So, for example, labels are incredibly stigmatizing. I mentioned earlier calling someone a slut, but official mental disorder diagnoses, narcissistic personality for men, sociopathic personality for men, narcissism and particularly borderline personality disorder for women, are all incredibly stigmatizing and in some ways really make people seem like lesser humans that people wouldn't want to be coworkers with, friends with, have romantic relationships with. So obviously being formerly incarcerated, an ex-con, having been to drug rehab, so being a drug addict. So in this case, we will call this like being sober. So if someone is an addict, they're always potentially in recovery. So there's things that are seen as stigmatizing. Homelessness, or sometimes what is called people who are homeless, so it's not define them by their homelessness, is also stigmatizing. But that very term, homeless, is really, for other people, that becomes the frame through which you view that person. Maybe they've only been homeless for a short period of time, only for maybe 1 month out of their entire life. But we have such major ideas about kind of abject urban poverty that just the word homeless or homelessness evokes so many strong emotions in people that it kind of reduces that person to that status or state. So the last one I'm going to leave you with is the medicalization of deviance. So I mentioned mental disorders earlier. So the big diagnostic tool for psychological professionals is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. Sounds like really fun bedtime reading. So this is kind of the official tome of the American Psychological Association. It's what counselors and clinicians use to diagnose people. And so I mentioned some of those disorders or diagnoses earlier that potentially, not inherently or necessarily, but potentially can be really stigmatizing for people, particularly in the way that some of them are gendered. So women overwhelmingly are diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, which seems really kind of arbitrary, because I think you have more variation within a sex or gender than between a sex or gender. So why there's such wild variation in mental disorder or mental diagnostic, I totally got my tongue tied. Why there is such variation for sex and gender across mental disorder diagnoses is something really interesting to think about. Another example, thinking about kind of the historical nature of deviance over time, is that mid-century homosexual behavior was categorized as a mental disorder in the DSM that I mentioned. So obviously now, being gay, engaging in same-sex behavior, is obviously much more normalized. It's no longer in the DSM. Thankfully, they took it out. But that's an example of the medicalization of deviance, because sexual behavior was seen as a medical disorder, some kind of mental disorder, to treat. So it was kind of an official diagnosis that something was wrong with you. And so, kind of to stay on that theme of same-sex sexuality, thinking about stigma, a lot of my dissertation research is on stigma. I study low-income tenants' experiences with lead poisoning, particularly when they're children are diagnosed with lead poisoning. So that's a feature of older, dilapidated urban housing. Think like the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. So I study things like that as part of my doctoral dissertation. And so having leaded children living in a leaded home is incredibly stigmatizing, makes it seem like you're a bad parent or like your kid is almost essentially mentally retarded when maybe they had a only slightly positive diagnosis that was easily medically treated. So in many cases, the stigma and the social consequences of that stigma can be, in some cases, far more consequential than the medical problem itself. And so, kind of another example I'll leave you with is same-sex sexual experimentation, particularly for men, but also for women, is that, let's say you're in college, you get drunk at a party, you do something crazy, you wake up next to someone who happens to look like you, has the same sex as you. You don't even know how you got there. You maybe don't even remember it. Other people may find out, and they think because you had one random sexual experience with a woman, if you're a woman, or a man with a man, if you're a man, that immediately means that you must be gay. I think now in 2019 we realize sexuality is a spectrum. People do crazy stuff. And doesn't mean anything. It's just behavior. But sometimes we want to see behavior as saying something about someone's kind of inherent state about who they are. And that's not necessarily true. Sometimes behavior means absolutely nothing. And so there can be or let's say someone tries cocaine once. All of a sudden people think they have some hard drug problem, when really they did it once, they didn't like it, realized it was a mistake, they don't do it again. But certain kinds of people find out and they stigmatize them as having some kind of hard drug problem. So stigma are these ideas, these kind of overly embellished, negative, stereotyping ideas, thinking back to chapter 1 about stereotypes and generalizations, that can really be harmful to people. So thinking about stigma, think of it as shame, social shame, but a shaming that is incredibly exaggerated compared to the actual gravity of the act. All right, so I went almost 20 minutes, more than I planned, but I think this is like my favorite chapter to teach. I think it encompasses all kinds of fun stuff. Hopefully I didn't say anything in this lecture that creeped you out. If I did, it wouldn't be the first time. In a few hours, I have a soccer game today, and hopefully we're going to see what I like to call goal time Mateo, which is when I score a goal and celebrate like a wild man. I don't just teach sociology all the time. Although playing soccer might be why my dissertation's not done. So thank you for listening to my lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. I think I'm going to set up a pretty fun and interesting discussion board question for you for this chapter, because it's obviously there's a lot of crazy stuff to talk about. But all of us have experienced some of the things in this chapter to some extent or another. So enjoy. Remember, your first major writing assignment is due tonight at midnight, if you're by chance watching this today, the 21st. And I will talk to you soon. Go out and be deviant in a non-illegal kind of way.